Most people in ancient Rome had nowhere to cook. The apartment blocks that housed the city's working population were built without kitchens. Some tenants kept a small clay brazier in a corner, barely large enough to warm a cup of wine. Most did not even have that. What they had instead was the Thermopolium, a stone counter built into the front wall of a building open to the street, with wide terracotta jars sunk into its surface. Behind the wall, a brick stove. Each jar held something hot. The ruins of Pompeii alone have preserved more than 150 of these counters, sometimes 3 or 4 on a single block. They were not a luxury. They were how the city fed itself. Quintus opened his counter before dawn every morning. He was a freedman. His master had released him a few years earlier, and this Thermopolium, 40 paces of stone counter on a busy commercial street, was the first thing he had ever owned. The boy arrived first, sent running to the neighborhood fountain with 2 clay jars. Water was the start of everything. Quintus lit the fire beneath the dolia and crouched beside them, waiting for the terracotta to warm through. The lentils had been soaking overnight. He drained them, measured a handful of cumin, and set them to simmer in the first dolium. Beside the counter he laid out boiled eggs, a bowl of olives, and a clay dish of soft cheese. The bread came from a baker 2 streets away, delivered each morning in linen-wrapped stacks. In the second dolium, he prepared a dish that kept his counter alive. Pork and bean stew, seasoned with pepper and a careful measure of garum. Garum was a fermented fish sauce, sharp and deeply savory, produced in coastal factories and shipped across the empire in tall clay amphorae. It found its way into more Roman meals than not. The quality of a counter's garum was something regular customers noticed. Quintus bought the best he could afford. The smell of the pork stew would carry halfway down the street before the first customer arrived. It was the one thing the woman who had opened a rival counter 4 doors down could not yet match. In the third dolium, he mixed wine with warm water and a spoonful of honey. Nobody in Rome drank wine undiluted. By the time the sky began to lighten, the counter was ready. 4 dolia filled, bread stacked behind the wall, a clay dish set out for coins. Quintus ran a hand along the stone edge. There was a crack near the corner, wider than it had been last month. He would deal with it later. The first customers did not wait for the sun. Dock workers arrived in 2s and 3s, their shifts starting at first light. They wanted lentils and bread. They wanted it now. Quintus ladled with one hand and took coins with the other. A bowl of lentil stew cost a singles, the smallest bronze coin in common use. The pork stew cost 2. It was the most expensive thing on his counter, and every morning it sold out first. A cup of honeyed wine was another as. For 3 small bronze coins, a working man could eat his fill, drink, and be on his way. One man came every morning at the same hour. A builder from the site across the road, broad-shouldered and quiet, always standing at the far end of the counter. He ordered the pork stew without speaking. Quintus already had the bowl filled before he reached the counter. By mid-morning, the counter was 3 deep. Builders, loom attendants from the fuller's workshop, and off-duty soldiers still wearing his belt. There were no tables. Customers ate standing, leaning against the stone or turning to face the street with a bowl balanced in one hand. It was not a restaurant. It was closer to a store built into a wall, and speed was everything. A thermopolium was also the nearest thing most neighborhoods had to a commons. News arrived here before it arrived anywhere else. Dock workers brought word from the harbor. Soldiers carried rumors from the barracks. By the time a story reached the forum, it had already been told 3 times at Quintus's counter. Quintus could see 3 rival counters from where he stood. The nearest served decent lentils and had been there longer than his. The newest had opened only a month ago, run by a woman who undercut everyone on wine by a fraction of a coin. He had already lost 2 regulars to her. Competition on a Roman commercial street was straightforward. Better food, faster service, or a lower price. There was no other advantage worth having. That morning Quintus noticed fresh painted marks on his outside wall. An election endorsement, painted overnight. Someone's preferred candidate for aedile, recommended to the voting public on the authority of Quintus's Thermopolium. Nobody had asked him. Thermopolium walls were prime space for this sort of thing. Some counter keepers endorsed candidates willingly. More often, the paint appeared between midnight and dawn without anyone's permission. Scribbing it off would cost half a morning and a bucket of lime. He left it. Quintus had learned early what an aedile's man looked like. They moved with a particular deliberateness, wax tablet tucked under one arm, never quite meeting the countercuter's eye. In his experience, enthusiasm for enforcement rose in the weeks before an election and fell away almost immediately after. The midday rush came and went. The lentils were nearly gone. The pork stew was half sold. The wine was holding. In the quiet that followed, the woman from the counter 4 doors down came to find him. An inspector had been working through the district since morning, she said. An aedile's man, checking what the counters were serving. 2 thermopolia further up the street had already been shut down. The charge was the same in both. Cooked meat. The older counter-keepers had a way of talking about crackdowns as though they were weather. Something in the season. Something in whoever was emperor. They had all seen one before. The stories got muddled in the telling. Tiberius and the pastry ban. Nero clearing the counters of everything except greens and pulses, if you believed the men whose grandfathers had survived it. Under Vespasian, even beans were briefly questioned, or so one old woman always insisted, and nobody had ever quite proved her wrong. Nobody behind a food counter had ever agreed on the reason. Some said it was about crowds. Too many working men in one place made certain emperors uneasy, or so the story went. Others said it was simpler. The old woman from the counter across the street had a way of putting it: they shut us down to remind us that they can. It never came steadily. Months would pass with nothing, the whole street settling into forgetting, and then a man with a wax tablet would appear at the top of the road. Every counter-keeper who saw him knew, before he had reached the second block, what kind of morning it had become. Quintus looked at his pork stew. Half a dolium remained. About 20 more bowls. At 2 asses each, there was 40 coins he could not afford to lose. A third of his daily revenue sat in that jar. If the inspector reached his counter and found cooked meat in the dolium, the consequence would not be a fine. It would be closure. For a freedman with no savings and rent owed at the end of the month, even a few days without trade would not be a setback. It would be the end of everything he had built. Quintus had spent 12 years in his master's kitchen before he was freed. He knew what it meant to own nothing. He emptied the dolium. The remaining stew went into the drain behind the wall. Beans, pork, pepper, garum. The smell of 40 lost coins running into the gutter. He rinsed it and filled it with water and vinegar. The sort of thing no inspector would question. The afternoon was quieter without the stew. The counter smelled of vinegar now, not pepper and pork. Customers paused at his counter, saw what remained, and walked to the 1-4 doors down. The builder from across the road did not come back for his afternoon bowl. The sun dropped behind the apartment blocks, and the street began to empty, fewer footsteps, then none. Quintus scraped the dolia clean with the wooden paddle while the boy swept the counter and stacked the breadboard against the wall. He rinsed each jar with vinegar and covered them with clay lids. The rats would come otherwise. Behind the wall, in a clay dish beside the light of an oil lamp, the day's coins waited. Quintus counted them twice. The total was short. He knew the reason. The coins for tomorrow's market came first: lentils, oil, bread, the baker's account. What remained after that was thinner than yesterday. He knew where the 40 coins had gone. They were in the drain behind the wall, and the month was not finished yet. At the end of each month, he set a portion into a cloth, a small square of undyed wool worn at the edges, heavier than it looked once the coins were in it. Never spoken of, never counted in front of anyone. A boy from his former master's household would come for it and leave before Quintus had finished the morning count. Quintus tipped the wash water into the gutter and ran a hand along the counter edge. The crack was still there, wider now. He had been saying he would fix it for a month. He went inside and pulled the door behind him. Tomorrow the pork would go back in the dolium. The inspector would have moved to another district, or he would not. Either way, the street would be hungry by dawn.